Okay, ready to dive into another historical deep dive?
Always.
This one's, well, kind of spooky. Yeah,
Oh,
picture this. It's 16th century England, and just imagine whispers of witchcraft are going through these little villages, cobblestone streets.
setting the scene already. I like it.
We're talking about the St. Osith witch trials, a moment in history where just a simple accusation can mean you live or die.
A bit intense, right? And what's so fascinating to me about this case is that we get to almost like peek into the lives of ordinary people during the Elizabethan era.
Right. It's not just dates and names in a textbook. We're going to
No.
meet real people, like mothers, neighbors, fathers,
Yeah.
all caught in this web of fear.
Absolutely.
And for our deep dive today, we have, well, Professor Marion Gibson's book as our guide.
Oh, yeah. The Witches of St Osith.
Yeah, that's the one. It really pieces together everything, historical records, trial transcripts, even personal accounts. You really get a vivid picture of how dark this period was.
And Professor Gibson, she really pushes the idea of like feeling history, understanding the emotions, realities of everyone involved. Let's try to like actually go back to that time. Imagine Essex, that bleak coastline, and how poverty and the aftershocks of the Reformation really shaped lives back then.
It's almost like you can smell the salt air and hear the seagulls when you describe it like that.
Yeah.
And then there's this law, right? The 1563 Witchcraft Act, a law that basically turns any little squabble, any disagreement you had with a neighbor into a crime.
Exactly. So imagine suddenly saying that someone harmed you through magic. That's something the courts would handle. You could be hanged, you could be imprisoned.
It's like wild to think about, living in a community where every little thing, every illness, every death, people thought, oh, it must be witchcraft.
And that's where the story of Grace Thurlow comes in. A servant who worked at, well, it was this very grand place called the St. Osith Priory.
Okay.
Her son, Davy, he gets sick, and she's desperate. So she goes to Ursley Kemp, the local cunning woman.
Now, for our listeners, I think we need to explain what a cunning woman is because it might not be a familiar term to everyone.
Right. A cunning woman was someone who practiced what we might call, like, folk medicine and magic. People went to them for healing. But as we'll see, being a healer also sort of made them a target for accusations.
Oh, I see. Interesting.
So Ursley, she does her thing. She performs a spell, a ritual for Davy, and it seems like he gets better.
Okay, so far so good.
Right. But then tragedy hits. Grace, she gives birth to a baby girl, Joan, and Joan tragically dies after falling from her cradle.
Oh, no.
And suddenly, everyone's pointing fingers at Ursley.
Wow, you can almost feel the tension, the grief in the air, can't you?
And here's something important about the power dynamics at play. Grace, as a servant, she doesn't accuse Ursley directly. She goes to the authorities at the priory, Brian Darcy. He was a magistrate and happened to be related to the priory's owners.
So it wasn't just a simple neighborly dispute.
No, not at all. And Darcy, he jumps into the witch hunter role with like so much enthusiasm. He gets fixated on this case. He's reading all these French demonological theories that were popular at the time.
Really?
Yeah, and he starts using like deception and even interrogates Ursley's kids, trying to get her to confess.
That's pretty intense.
And it makes you wonder, why would Ursley confess under all that pressure? Was it Darcy? Was it the fear? Or was there maybe something more going on? Maybe like some tiny bit of doubt in her own mind?
A flicker of like, maybe I did do something wrong.
Right, exactly. Professor Gibson, she points out that women like Ursley, well, their role as a healer could easily be twisted into proof of witchcraft. Makes you think how many others who just wanted to help ended up in similar situations,
Yeah.
accused of the very thing they were trying to do good with. Absolutely.
So it's not as simple as, oh, she was a witch and she did bad things. It's more complex than that.
Way more complex.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, Ursley, she doesn't just confess to hurting the baby. She says, I didn't do it alone. She names names. Like her friend, Alice Newman.
Oh, wow. So now it's not just one person. It's a conspiracy.
It becomes this domino effect. The entire village gets pulled in.
And who are these people being accused? Like, is there a pattern?
That's what's so fascinating. The backgrounds of everyone are so different. You have older women, younger women, a farmer's wife, even a man gets caught up in it. It smashes any simple ideas we might have about who gets targeted in a witch hunt.
It's almost like it becomes this outlet for all their anxieties, all their resentments.
You know, this is where Professor Gibson's idea of feeling history comes in. We need to like step into their shoes, the fear, the confusion. They wake up one day and their world is upside down because of these accusations.
It's especially heartbreaking when you think about the baby, Joan. Her death, it starts this whole chain of events that just destroys lives. And Ursley's son, he could lose his mom if she's found guilty.
It's a powerful reminder that we're not just talking about things in the past, but real people with families, emotions, live.
And now, for the spooky part, let's talk about familiars.
Yes, familiars. The demonic spirit animals that people believed helped witches.
Okay, like a witch's pet.
Kind of. Ursley, in her confession, describes all these creatures. Cats, a lamb, even a ferret that supposedly messed with her dinner one night.
It's almost like something out of a scary story. It really shows how people back then tried to understand things they couldn't explain. But here's a question I have. If these familiars were so powerful, why were the things they supposedly did so small, so minor?
Good point. Were they just an excuse to blame everyday problems on, or, maybe a way to project fears and anxieties onto something else? Some scholars think these familiar confessions were influenced by old folk tales or even personal grief, like maybe they described familiars that resembled children they had lost.
Okay, wow. So it's layers upon layers here. It's not just good versus evil, black and white.
Exactly. And all of this, the accusations, the confessions, the familiars, they all lead to this one big event, the trial.
The climax of the story.
It all goes down at the Chelmsford Market Cross. It was this huge public event. Imagine judges, juries, crowds of people, all watching to see what happens to these accused individuals.
Must have been terrifying and exciting all at the same time. Like I don't know, a play, but with real-life consequences.
And Brian Darcy, our enthusiastic witch hunter, he plays a big part in the trial. He even publishes a book about it all afterwards.
He writes a book about the trials.
Yep. It actually gives us some great insights into the legal system, what people believed, but we have to read it carefully, right? Darcy has his own biases. He wants to tell a certain story.
We can't take everything at face value.
Right. It's like we have a puzzle and some pieces are missing and others have been moved around. We have to try and figure out the truth and all that. And the verdicts in the trial, they add another layer of complexity. Not everyone's found guilty. Some are set free. Others get a reprieve.
So even in the middle of this witch hunt, there was still some doubt, some sense of fairness.
I think so. It suggests that some people weren't convinced by what they saw and heard, or maybe they were already questioning the whole idea of witchcraft.
It's almost like even then, people were starting to think critically, to say, hold on, maybe this isn't so simple.
Exactly.
So we see this society struggling with poverty, with religion changing, and with this very human need to find someone to blame when things go wrong.
That's what's so powerful about this story, right? It makes us look at ourselves and ask, how can fear and suspicion turn into something so destructive?
It's a reminder that history isn't just dates and names. It's about people and their lives. And those lessons from the past, they can still teach us a lot today.
I agree.
The dangers of scapegoating, the power of what we choose to believe, how fragile life can be when society turns against you. These are things that are still relevant.
And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, we're left with this powerful image, these ordinary people just trying to live their lives, and suddenly everything changes because of these accusations.
Makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. Professor Gibson reminds us how important empathy is when we study history. We can't just look at the facts. We need to try to understand what these people felt, what they went through.
It's about seeing them as human beings, not just characters in a historical drama.
Exactly. And by connecting with them, with their stories, we can maybe understand not just the past, but ourselves a little better too. Welcome back to our deep dive into the St. Osith witch trials.
Okay, so we set the stage, we know about the accusations, and now it's time to kind of think about the aftermath.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like what happens after the trials.
Yeah, and I think what really strikes me is the impact on the community, the personal cost of all of this.
Right, it wasn't just a courtroom drama, it was real lives being torn apart.
Exactly. Think about like Ursley Kemp's confession and what it did to, say, Alice Newman.
Her friend, right, the one she accused.
Yeah, Alice, she said she was innocent, that Ursley made it all up under pressure, but once that accusation is out there,
The damage is done.
it really is. You can't help but think about the whispers, the distrust. How could a community ever really recover from something like this?
It's a lot to process. And Professor Gibson, she talks about this idea of feeling history. And I feel such sadness for those who lost loved ones, like Ursley's son. Imagine growing up without your mother because of this.
It's a powerful reminder that these events, they're not just abstract, they have real consequences, a human cost that echoes through generations. The trials might be over, but the pain, the loss, the questions, they stay with people.
And some of those questions are still relevant today, aren't they? Like how easily we can scapegoat others, how we look for simple answers when things are complicated and bad, and the potential for injustice when fear takes over.
Absolutely. We see it all the time, even now. How quickly people point fingers, blame others for problems that have so many causes. It's dangerous, that oversimplification. It leads to real harm.
It makes you realize that history, it's not really past, is it? It's still with us in so many ways.
It's a lesson, a warning. And it's up to each of us to learn from it, to try to build a better future, a more just world.
And beyond the big picture stuff, I think it's important to remember the people at the heart of it all, those individual stories.
Yes, exactly. They're not just names in a book. They were mothers, daughters, friends, people with hopes and dreams, just like us.
It's easy to get lost in the legal stuff, the social theories, but we have to keep that human element in mind.
Professor Gibson, she does such a good job of bringing those figures to life, using their own words from the trial transcripts. It reminds us that history, it's about people.
And when we hear those voices, those stories, we understand more than just the past.
Right. We understand ourselves better, our own capacity for good and bad.
There's a line in Professor Gibson's book that stuck with me. History without empathy is only half a story.
Oh, that's a good one. It's a reminder to connect with the emotions, the reality of what happened.
To see those connections across time between us and them.
And maybe by doing that, we can start to understand events like the St. Osith trials and what they mean for us today.
You know, as we've been talking, I keep thinking about Brian Darcy. He's almost like this larger-than-life character, this magistrate who is just, like, obsessed with finding witches.
Yeah, his enthusiasm for uncovering witchcraft and the methods he used, it raises some big questions about power and justice in that time period.
It's almost like he was determined to find witches, whether they were there or not. And then he writes a whole book about it. Was he just trying to document things? Or was it more about, like, boosting his own reputation?
Good question. Historians are still debating his motivations, but whatever they were, his book gives us so much information about the laws, the social dynamics, what people believed back then.
But again, we have to be careful, right? It's like we're putting a puzzle together and some pieces are missing. We might never have the full picture.
And that's part of what makes studying history so challenging and so rewarding. We may never know all the answers, but trying to find them, that's how we learn.
It's like detective work, almost. Searching for clues, trying to solve a mystery from centuries ago. And even if we don't get all the answers, the journey itself is what matters.
I like that detective work. And, sometimes the questions we're left with are more important than the answers. They make us think critically, question what we think we know.
Makes you realize how much we don't know.
Right. It keeps us humble and reminds us that history isn't some fixed thing. It's an ongoing conversation.
We're all part of that conversation, trying to
Yeah.
understand the past and how it shapes us today.
Okay, before we finish up our deep dive, there's one more thing I think we should talk about. Skepticism, doubt.
Oh, interesting. How does that fit into all of this?
Well, even though a lot of people in Elizabethan England believed in witchcraft, there were some who questioned it all. The accusations, the evidence. They weren't saying witchcraft was impossible, but they were worried about how those accusations could be used against people unfairly.
Like, are we talking about people like Reginald Scott, the guy who wrote The Discovery of Witchcraft? He was very vocal about, like, not persecuting witches, right?
Yeah, that's him. His work, it came out just a few years after the St. Osith trials. He was a voice of reason in a time when fear was running high.
He was challenging what everyone else was saying. That takes courage.
It does. And it reminds us that history isn't like one big story everyone agrees on. There were always people who thought differently, who spoke up for justice, even when it was dangerous.
Makes me wonder, did those skeptical voices have any impact on the St. Osith trials? Like, maybe they influenced the jury, led to some of those mixed verdicts?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's possible. Maybe some people just weren't convinced by the evidence. Maybe they had doubts about the whole thing.
So even in a system that was often biased against the accused, there were moments of fairness, of people trying to do the right thing.
Exactly. And those moments, they're important to remember. They give us hope. They remind us that even in dark times, there are always people fighting for what's right.
It's like looking at this tapestry, with all these different threads, light and dark. And it's our job to try and understand it all, to learn from those patterns. The St. Osith trials, as tragic and complex as they were, they offer us this glimpse into the past. They're a reminder of our own humanity.
And how important it is to keep searching for justice, always.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the St. Osith witch trials. We've gone through the accusations, the trials, those personal stories, and now I think it's time to zoom out a little. Look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, good idea.
Like, what was happening in England back then that allowed these witch hunts to take place?
Right. What were the underlying forces at play that created this atmosphere of fear and suspicion?
We've mentioned the Reformation a couple of times. England was going through a huge religious shift, right? New ideas, new beliefs. I imagine that can cause a lot of anxiety for people, trying to figure out, like, what's true, what to believe.
It definitely contributed to a climate where blaming witchcraft made sense to people. Think about it. Back then, they were searching for reasons why bad things happened. Illness, bad crops, anything that seemed wrong.
Right. They needed someone to blame.
And in that world where the devil was this powerful force, witchcraft was an easy answer.
It's like blaming like a cosmic bad guy,
Yeah.
right? Makes things simpler.
And remember, belief in magic and witchcraft wasn't new. It had been around for a long time.
Yeah, that's true.
But with the Reformation, this idea of spiritual warfare, good versus evil, it all got, like, amplified.
So witchcraft wasn't just some personal thing. It was a threat to everyone.
Exactly. It was a threat to, like, the soul of England. And the trials, they were a way to kind of control people, reinforce the power of the church and the state.
Oh, so it's about more than just like individual disputes or personal grudges.
Way more. It's about using those accusations to shape society, to say, this is what we believe, this is who we are.
And we can't forget about the economic situation in St. Osith, can we? They were facing poverty, hardship. Could that have made the witch hunt worse?
Absolutely. When people are struggling, they look for someone to blame. It's a very human instinct.
Like if we're all in this together and things are bad, it must be someone's fault.
Right. And often, those who are different or already vulnerable became the targets. Sadly, it's a pattern that keeps repeating throughout history.
It's almost like the poverty created these cracks in the community. And those accusations were like hammers smashing things apart.
Powerful image. It shows how economic problems can create conditions for persecution, for blaming others. And the St. Osith trials, they really highlight that. The accusations were all about harm, about disrupting the community, about threatening their like spiritual safety.
So it's not just about superstition or magic. It's about power, about control, and how societies deal with those who don't fit in.
Exactly.
And it's a lesson we can apply today, right? We need to be careful, watch out for those same patterns, especially when times are tough, when people are afraid.
Because those are the times when injustice can easily take root. The St. Osith trials, they're a warning from history.
A reminder that, like, scapegoating, looking for easy answers, ignoring fairness and justice, those things can happen anywhere, anytime. It's about more than just witches. It's about how we treat each other, how we build a fair and just society.
Well said.
History isn't just something that happened a long time ago. It's a source of knowledge, of warnings, and of challenges for us to think about, to act upon.
I agree. We can learn from the past, from the mistakes that were made, to create a better future.
Exactly. And we can honor those who suffered, like in the St. Osith trials, by remembering their stories, by fighting for justice, by working together to make sure those kinds of tragedies don't happen again.
Well said. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive.
We've gone through a lot, haven't we? The accusations, the trials, the aftermath. It's a complex story,
It is?
but it's one that's worth knowing, worth thinking about.
Absolutely.
So thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope it sparked your curiosity, challenged your thinking, and maybe, just maybe, left you with a little bit of a deeper understanding of how the past shapes who we are today. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking the truth.